Hello, welcome back to BlenderSushi Live Noding. In this video, I'm going to share with you this experiment that I was doing using Sverchok and Blender Dynamic Rigid Body Dynamics. So the final effects is looking something like this. So it's basically, you can see it's a bunch of objects being emitted, and they're all in kind of a different shapes, slightly random, and then each one of them is kind of reacting to the gravity, and they falls down and they hit the ground, and they're doing what's Blender Rigid Body Dynamic is usually doing. Yeah, I found this kind of interesting effects. It's it's kind of affects our simulations that usually you will find in a program like Side Effects Houdini. Basically, with Side Effects Houdini, the way they set it up, you can create particles, and you can emit particles, but each particles in sensor can be like a real objects that will behave to the solver of the rigid body dynamics solver, all bullet dynamics, kind of similar to what Blender has, but not you don't really see you don't normally see that in Blender. But I thought this is quite interesting, and I'm using Sverchok to generate all these procedural random shapes of a mesh dynamically as well. So it's generating one different shapes for every frame. Yeah, so if you want to have a look at the setup early on, I'll give it I'll show it to you. So this is our 3D view, and this is our Sverchok setup. Basically, it's really simple. So we have this viewer bmesh mk2 that's gonna output the objects over here, and we have this matrix in that's gonna generate one new vector locations per frame using this random vector. And I have this frame info plug it into this to this is, so basically this guy is gonna generate the transform. Okay, and while in Sverchok we always need to care about the vertices, edges, and faces. For our shape here, we just need to worry about the vertices and faces. The edges can be left. Here, the important part is I have the list repeater that's gonna repeat the same amount of transform we generated here down below. And I have this box generator that's gonna create the box. And then I'll have this randomized input vertices that's randomizing the shape of each boxes. And the range integer, this is to randomize each shape using the seed. So yeah, let's try this from scratch. File save as, this is SV rigid RBD rigid body dynamic experiment. If you watch my previous live noding, and oftentimes you see Sverchok crashing, I have to make a note here that it's not like Sverchok, or it could be also my Mac OS. I'm currently using the Mac OS beta. It's the latest version, like I think 10.12.1. I can't remember the number, but yeah. So sometimes either Mac or Blender, or if it's with Sverchok, the developers are currently looking at it and checking the Blender crash log and try to fix this crashing issue. It could be the OpenGL thing that's in the Mac OS. It's kind of in the OpenGL language. So anyway, I always save my blend every time before I make any kind of operation, so it's no problem. Yeah. So first of all, I have to show you Blender rigid body first. It's really pretty simple to set up. If let's say I have this floor, and I have this cube, and if I turn this into a rigid body, I go to this physics panel, and turn on rigid body. By default it's active. We want it to be passive because it's a floor. And if the object shape is kind of like boxy, we can turn this from the default convex hull into box. And also I need to apply the transformations to the location, rotation, and scale. And this object, it's currently with dimension, I think I scaled it down as well. That's the original dimension. It's one, I think it's a it's 1 meter by default. So the unit will matter as well for any kind of rigid body dynamics. So I need to be aware of that. And now I turn it into active rigid body. So it's gonna be behaving to gravity and it's gonna collide with this floor. Yeah, so there you go. That's the rigid body by dynamics. I think the origin also matters, so I need to set the origin to the geometry, and I'll try and make fill. Okay, now it's behaving more properly. Again, the thing about Blender is, if I see this is the dynamic playing and then I grab the objects, I can actually play around with it, and we kind of can create duplicates on the go. So that's the key point here. I kind of wish that Blender particles will be able to generate like the rigid body objects at some point, but for now we're gonna use Sverchok. So reload it, switch to compositing, delete the default objects, hide everything. Actually, just leave it there. Switch to Sverchok, new file, save as, save it to the same blend file. Okay, let's generate some random objects first. Generator, let's see, instead of using box, I will use something that's more interesting looking. Maybe the rounded box. Yeah, let's use rounded box, and let's look at the output of this guy. I'm gonna save, plug in the vertices and the polygon. This is the viewer draw. It's not giving anything because it's expecting this vector size. I use vector in and just plug it in there. So that's the objects being generated. I can bake it, and that's the final result. Okay, that's one rounded box object. We're gonna soon turn this into like a rigid body. Let me think how to do this. So instead of using the viewer draw, I will use a real object, and it's a bmesh mk2. This will output an actual object in the scene. Okay, so that's a real object, and we can turn this into a rigid body dynamic. I'll create a floor. I'll use cube and scale it in Z, and apply the location, rotation, scale, and place the floor somewhere like that, and turn this into rigid body dynamic and passive. So that's the first thing to do, and then I will create a cube and turn this into active, just for kind of like a template for our thingy. Okay, so that thing's being generated. First I will hide the grid, and I'll use the display. There's actually render. There's something in Sverchok that we can use to kind of tidy up the view. I think it's 3D view props. Yep, 3D view for prop here. You can see we have grid and everything, and this node can take care of the setting for us. At the moment the grid is showing up, we can hide the grid. We can also turn off the X and the Y axis, so that's a lot cleaner. And the grid, actually that's the color, the grid for the grid. You know, I can make it white if I want, but I'm turning off the grid. And the background color, let's make it a green for today. Yeah, somewhere, something like that. Green. Okay. So that's 3D view props node. Back to this guy. You see, with the rigid body dynamic, you may notice that the 3D objects are having these green outlines, meaning they are actually grouped. And if we check here under group, it says rigid body world. So and the way I observe this is, okay, apparently in Blender, if we are using rigid body dynamics, they kind of grouping it so it's more manageable that way. So for our Blender thing, with the setup with the Sverchok here, I will want to kind of group the objects using the rigid body world as well. And I will use animation nodes. It's because animation nodes has this grouping mechanics. For the objects that are being generated from Sverchok, I will group it as well, but I'm gonna call it alpha. So if I update it and select this object, you can see this object is also being grouped and it's named alpha. Now what's happening here, I'm going to use animation nodes and use the objects from group. I'll select alpha. I'm gonna turn off the always and just switch on this tree to make the thing a little bit faster. So this is grabbing the group from Sverchok. Sverchok will generate like mesh for us, and this guy will, if I loop it, so for each of every object inside the alpha group, I will want to use this object group operations and place the objects into the rigid body world group. So this is like a special kind of operation in the background. So animation nodes now serving this Sverchok generated objects in the background. So whatever objects being created and put into the alpha group will then turn into a dynamics. You can see our rounded box is dynamically moving. With the floor here, I want to make it more bouncy. So I'll increase the bounce, and friction I'll reduce it. I will probably rotate this floor as well, so it's more interesting to look at. Let's try it with our rounded box. See, it's all behaving, and Sverchok is like generating this guy dynamically, so it's really cool. But at the moment we only have a single rounded box. Let's make a couple of rounded box. Let's do that real quick. So this is generating the rounded box. If it's for speed, I can actually use box. Yeah, let's use box just for the speed purpose. As you can see, the objects is updating right away now. Okay, still working. So we have this box, 1 unit size, around 1 meter. So we want a bunch of this box, and I will use matrix for that. Matrix in, okay, and random vector. Okay, should I use random vector? Maybe I'll use random vector later. I will use line or integer range, maybe float range. Okay, range float. And vector in. So here, what I'm thinking to do is to generate like generate a bunch of cube along the x-axis, and I will do that by using count or maybe step. Yeah, step will do the job for us. Start at 0, 0, 0. Step. Every step is 1 unit to in the and I just plug it to the x, and that's what we get. It's kind of like creating array. So okay, apparently the x-axis is that way. Okay, so I can have more, like less or more of this, and I can increase it dynamically. So that's the plan. Let's move the floor. Let's rotate the floor like this. So you know, if I'm doing it like that now, if I'm generating a lot of cubes, they're all gonna fall into the floor. Yeah, so that's pretty good. Let's create 5 for now and save and playback. So obviously it's 5 different cubes and they just fall. It's already a pretty cool effects happening. Even before I do the randomization here, this is already like a box being generated procedurally over time. So this is a really cool setup already. If I'm using like a frame info node here and I plug the current frame into the count, what's happening here is for every frame, Blender and Sverchok will generate like a cube, and then it's continuously generating the objects unlimitedly. While doing that, it's also doing this dynamic simulations at the bottom, so you can kind of like born these rigid body objects on the fly. This is I think this is really cool. If we want it to have a different size scale, it's also possible. We can probably randomize it in here, but I need to be careful. Like I said, if we are starting to mesh with a location, scale, and rotation, we need to be aware that this is a dynamic simulation, so maybe it's not behaving as we want it. Let's try. Actually, I'm not gonna do the scale today. I'm just gonna randomize the box for now. And one thing that to notice that this guy might be generating a lot of objects over time. You don't want you kind of want to limit that, and you also want to maybe turn off the dynamics when it's reaching certain points. There is this enable deactivation button here. So basically for object that's kind of settled in, it's gonna stop the calculations. This is kind of important. If you are serious about doing this, you might wanna enable deactivations for each object being generated, and you can use animation nodes for that side of thing. Let's now just randomize the box using the just kind of like displace the vertices of these objects. Let's do that, but I'm gonna use a replicated list repeater. So this is a more correct way. At the moment, this is a single object and multiple transform. Sverchok will generate like a real objects based on this matrix. But if you want to have like a random shapes, we need to use list repeater. So I'll plug in the data of the vertices into this guy, and the number I will use frame. and I think I need to unwrap that and plug in the data into the vertices. Same thing with the polygon faces indices. So I think this is correct. Let's check it real quick. Level unwrap, so the number need to get it from that. So this is more correct. If you see the same number in vertices, faces, and matrix, that means we can have like each of the objects can have different variations. Now if I plug in something like randomize input vertices, plug that in and slightly increase the amplitude, maybe increase the stepping of each object. Now each object is slightly different from one another. Yeah, so that's pretty much what you need to do if you want to have like random shapes, and then each one of them should behave quite differently now, and they have different shape and they're all dynamics. So that's really cool. Let's further experiment with this. Since we already have the setup, it's easy for us to change the input of the input of this. Instead of box, you can have anything that Sverchok can generate, or you can also source the object from outside. And here with the placement of the objects, instead of something that looks like an array here, instead of like objects being arranged like that, we can also, of course, randomize this. So let's cut this and let's use random vector mk2. So this is new. Now we have a scale. Let's plug this into the count, and the seed can be any number. Scale, you can now scale the vector of the random vector. Plug this into the location, and now it's being born at a random position here, but we can increase the scale. Oh yeah, because I'm doing some crazy thing. It crashes, and let's reopen Blender. This is the crash log. I will need to submit it to Blender Sverchok developer. Select all. Let's open a text pad. Get a blank text. I'll run another Blender. Save. External application VM. I think something to do with the OpenGL. Save this. What's the date today? 2016 10/27. Crash log. Blender crash log. Save. Okay. Let's hide that. Close this. Let's jump back to Blender real quick. I saved the blend file, so don't worry. Yeah, I think using rigid body is with Sverchok, it's all a bit experimentative. So let's make this full screen. Go back to the files, save as, and go back to the first frame. Let's scale this, maybe like 10. Now the random position of the box is being spread all within 10 units. So there you go, that's the effects we're getting. Maybe I can turn on the ambient occlusion. Not gonna work in this case. It's gonna slow down the thing, so don't worry. Maybe matcap. Matcap looks nicer. Alright, so that's cool. You can see with a random vector, it's kind of spawning this cube, kind of like spherical area. We can, if I want to spread it only in the X and Y, let's do it like this. Back to frame 1. Now it's being spread like in the XY plane. It's kind of like raining boxes at the moment. Bring the floor a little bit up. Let's save this file, save as. What else can we try? So instead of the box, we can go back to the rounded box. Like that. Okay, let's switch to full screen and Alt A. Now we have something that's more like a stone, like a, and they're all dynamics and they're following, they're behaving like a dynamic object. So they collide, they have different shapes. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Let's try the scaling thing. I'm kind of curious. We don't need the rotations, but the scale I'm more kind of curious. If we use the vector in for the scale, let's say I want to generate a bunch of objects with a certain scale, we can use random number here, plug in the count there, and the seed. Oh, okay, we need to randomize the seed as well. That's for each object we need a random seed. I think it should be randomizing the thing automatically, unless I'm not. Let's just use range integer and turn on the count, plug in the count there, and plug this to the seed. And now with random, with random, it's gonna generate value between 0 and 1, so I wanna remap that as well. 0 to 1 and becoming between 1.6 and 1.6. Plug this as the scale. So let's see what we got now. Use a cube. I think this is the dynamic cube, we don't need it. Playback. So now the dynamic objects have different scale. Let's see if they are still behaving properly. Yeah, they are still correctly behaving, like it's not just using the bounding, it's using the convex hull by default, and that's really neat. It's actually quite fast because I'm recording, and maybe at some point I will try to bake these simulations. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Now there is one more thing that I want to share with you. Instead of letting this frame info to control everything, we want to have a control over this guy. So currently it's using the frame number to continuously generating objects. We don't want that. Yeah, we probably want that, but we want it maybe to stop or kind of like trigger this guy. The value is just currently running. So the way to do that is using something like switch. So we can say like, okay, this is the current frame. I will plug it into true. There's kind of like a state here. The state is either true or false, so it's a boolean for this guy. And this is the data if true, and this data if false. And we can have multiple switch. So we just need one switch for now, one true and false. So we know that the data is coming from here. There is a formula, like a formula node. This is kind of like expression. We can say, okay, this is the current frame of the time. If I plug this in, and then I'll say x smaller than 10, it's kind of like a condition. If the value coming in to this guy is smaller than 0, give it a result. The result is either true or false. So I'll show it to you using the stethoscope. It's currently true because of course our time frame is smaller than 10. If I play back, at some point it's gonna turn false because the frame is now over 10, bigger than 10, so it's 13, so it's become false. So we can use this condition. This is, I'll write down condition. If we plug this into the state's gonna turn from true to false at some point. So if it's true, keep using this number. If it's false, use a value that we provided. Maybe I'll use a integer here and give it a value of maybe 30 in this case. Okay, so 30. If it's if the frame number is over 30, just stop the simulations. So switch to full screen. I'll turn on matcap, and okay, the blue is nice. And okay, ambient occlusion just for fun. Now, what's the button to shift control down arrow? Shift control down arrow. Full screen. Shift control down arrow. Okay, back to frame 1. Alt A and playback. See our rigid body being spawned by Sverchok. Animation nodes in the background is putting the Sverchok group objects into the rigid body dynamic objects, and they're all simulating now. Okay, cool. Maybe the ambient occlusion needs to be a little bit stronger, maybe 5. At some point it should stop spawning, like frame 30 up. That means like 30 objects. After 30 objects, stop spawning the objects and keep the simulation running. I think I need to have a timeline. And T. Timeline. Looks like it keeps spawning. I think I forgot to do something here. Oh, I didn't plug the count. I didn't plug the output into the count. Okay, sorry, my mistake. Don't forget, once you create the switch, you plug this into the count of each of these. Okay, back to 3D view. I'm gonna kind of maybe back to default, and I'm gonna have like proper floor here, so this stuff gonna fall into that floor. And also with the dynamics, how many frames you want to cache it, it's controlled right here, rigid body cache under scene tab. Let's end it at around frame 1000. Switch to 3D view full, change this to 1000. Now I am sure that our simulation stops at frame after frame 30. It's gonna stop spawning objects. Okay, so that's I think that's like a 30 objects, or actually I was wrong. It keeps spawning objects. Maybe my condition value is wrong. Maybe I should turn this into 0. If it's false, yeah, maybe that's what it should. Yeah, it should be 0, but maybe we need a way to maybe tell Sverchok stop calculating. Currently it's giving error message because I'm giving like a, because this guy becomes 0 and it doesn't like it. What if this is 1? So after frame 30, it's still spawning the thing. Yeah, it should be 0 or -1. I think it should be 0. Kind of need a way to stop this. Maybe it's like a question, kind of like a feature request. Stop Sverchok calculations after frame 30 or something. Let's do it again. Anyway, let's keep going with this. We can still cache the simulations. After frame 30, Sverchok's gonna be giving like error message, I think, to Blender. Hey, you're not giving me any kind of informations. But this Blender simulation is still running, and we can cache it for 1000 frames. Maybe export it out as Alembic and bring it to another scene and then render it out properly. Because case with kind of simulations, you always want to bake it at some point, or even if you are doing something like procedural or generative, and you kind of want to bake it at some point before you render. Let's make everything more stable. This is yeah, it's doing like a hiccup thing. I think there must be like an error message being generated. Node matrix exception list index out of range. Yep, of course. Let's wait for few more frames. Okay, that's good. Now everything's settled. Now I'm wondering, now if should I delete it, or what happens if I delete all this? And do we still have the objects? We still have simulations. It's not being cached. We don't have any kind of Sverchok anymore, but we have these objects being spawned, and they're behaving just like a normal rigid body. So yeah, I guess this is quite a good workflow to do this kind of simulations. So procedurally generate some bunch of objects using Sverchok and randomize your rigid body and then run the simulations. Okay, so that's all pretty much I want to share with you in this live loading. Thanks again for watching. Leave like and comments down below if you have any question or suggestion or any kind of comments. I will read it and reply as soon as possible. And thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next video.